Elden Ring has an expansion called Shadow of the Erdtree. I'm going to talk about it from a game designer's perspective and go over several of the design decisions in this game and try to explain them and provide context and tell you what I think worked well and what didn't. And I'm going to do my best to avoid any spoilers. So let's get into it. I'm not trying to do a traditional review here, but if that's what you're looking for, I'll just throw it in for free because it's super easy for Shadow of the Erdtree. Just ask yourself two questions. One, did you like Elden Ring? And two, would you be okay with an expansion that's really hard? If the answer is yes to both of those things, then you should buy this expansion, and I think you would really enjoy it. Overall, I think it's really good, maybe even a masterpiece. So yeah, buy it. And as a meta point here, if we take a step back, I think it's worthwhile to buy it just to support FromSoft. FromSoft is a different voice in the game industry. They're really doing things differently than other companies, and I'm glad that they exist and they're out there. So it's nice to support them and make sure that they keep doing it. Just like it's nice to support any indie designers. You wouldn't want Capcom being the only company that made fighting games, for example, so you can check out my fighting game, Fantasy Strike, on Steam and buy the core pack if you like it and want to support the developer, or buy YOMI 2 on Steam, which is a fighting card game. Part 1, Scadutree Fragments. Let's get into the game design of this expansion. The first thing I want to talk about are the Scadutree Fragments. Skippy-Doo, Scadopoo, Scooby-Doo, Scadutree Fragments. These things are a bit controversial, so let's talk about what they are exactly and why they exist. These are items that are scattered around the world of the expansion, and you collect them to buff yourself, to buff your attack power and your defense, but they only do that within the realm of the expansion. They don't do anything if you travel back to the base game. There are a total of 50 of these fragments in the expansion, and you need to turn in a few at a time to get an upgrade. You can get a maximum of 20 levels of upgrade. Each level is giving you, well, it was about 4.5% attack power stacking multiplicatively when the game launched, but they adjusted it a little bit so that they are front loading these, and the first few give you more of a bonus than the final few. The math behind these Scadutree Fragments gives us a clue as to what the designers were thinking here and what the whole mechanic is for. If you compare the power level of your character right when you enter the DLC to later when you have all of the Scadutree Fragments and you have a maxed level 20 bonus, your bonus damage is a little bit more than double. And that scale, that progression of going from a certain damage level to a little more and more and more and more until you've more than doubled it, mirrors the progression of damage that you get in the base game when you upgrade your weapons. You can upgrade unique weapons with somber smithing stones up to a level of 10, and you can upgrade the rest of the weapons with regular smithing stones up to a level of 25, but those are comparable to each other. Level 10 in one category is basically the same power level as level 25 in the other, and that is about twice as much damage as if you don't upgrade it, a little bit more. So that's a nice clue, but what's really going on here? Why even have this mechanic in the first place? It's a bit weird. It's kind of not what you would expect. So let's think about it for a moment. Let's imagine that the mechanic did not exist at all. So you enter this DLC and you're supposed to have an end game character. You're supposed to be level 150 or so, and you have a solid build. I want to make 2 points about progression here. And the first is very simple. It applies to pretty much any RPG in the genre. It's just the concept that you get more powerful over time as you play through the game. That's how Elden Ring works. That's how all the other FromSoft games work. It's a very normal, standard idea. But the other concept is special to Elden Ring compared to the FromSoft games that came before it. And that is, if you reach a boss and it's difficult, you can just leave, because Elden Ring is an open world. You can go do any number of other things. And in doing those other things, you become more powerful so that you can go back to the boss and you're more powerful and maybe you have a better chance of beating it. So you can kind of self-regulate the difficulty that you are signing up for. This aspect of Elden Ring is, I think, a very key factor to what made it so successful. So back to the expansion, we immediately have a problem if we do not have some sort of new mechanic to handle progression. Because if we just did nothing, then how it would work is you'd fight a boss and it's difficult and maybe you'd leave and go look around, but are you really going to be more powerful? Well, one way that you can be more powerful in the base game and in the expansion is you can level up. But leveling up has diminishing returns, and the expansion starts at about the point where those diminishing returns have really kicked in. So if you fight a boss in the expansion and you have trouble, and so you leave and you manage to level up 5 times and then come back, the difference in your power level there is going to be very small compared to if you did the very same thing in the base game, where those levels are adding more power. Also, there's a concept of leveling up your weapons that I talked about, and you're expected to have already maxed weapons. So in the base game, maybe you'd leave a boss and then find more smithing stones and level up your weapon, but that's not really a thing in the expansion. You already have the strongest weapons you can have. So if you fought a boss and then had trouble and then went and looked around and explored and tried to find new things, how else could you become more powerful? Well, you could find new weapons that did different things. You could find new ashes of war to put on those weapons. You could find new pieces of armor. You could find new incantations or sorceries to cast. You could find new talismans. But all of these things run into the same kind of problem where maybe there's some new incantations that are a little more powerful. Maybe there's new talismans that are more powerful. Yeah, okay. But how much more powerful? It's not going to be anywhere near the jump that you were getting in the base game as you progress through it. And by kind of definition about how builds work, like most of these things you find are going to be useless to your build, like literally unusable. Maybe you'll find a sorcery, but you don't have a character that can even really use that sorcery, or ashes of war for weapon types that you aren't using. So I think what must have happened, if we could look into the design room to see the discussions that went on about this, probably somebody suggested, well, shouldn't we have the weapons upgrade past the level that they used to? So the unique weapons were getting up to Somber Smithing Stone level 10, and the other ones were getting to 25. Well, what if in the expansion we let you level up Somber weapons, not just to 10, but all the way to 20, and we let you level up the other type of weapons, not to 25, but all the way to 50. And we could give you, over time, double the amount of damage over the course of the expansion. And I can just picture Miyazaki thinking about it and then saying that he doesn't like it for a couple reasons. One thing is that even though that may achieve the goal that they want in the expansion, that's going to completely ruin the base game. The base game is already bursting at the seams of how powerful you can get. And if we're allowing you to have double strength weapons and then go back to the base game, it's just totally ridiculous and too much. So we can make those extra weapon upgrades not count in the base game, but that's actually pretty confusing. And also, it's not just attack power that we're concerned with here. We want your defensive power to scale up over the course of playing through the DLC as well. And even if we had more weapon upgrades, then we need a defense thing. So should we add more new pieces of armor that are just straight up more powerful than the old ones and replace all of the old ones? That's a really bad idea, actually. Should we let you level up your old armor? That's not a mechanic that exists in the game, but maybe the expansion could add that, could add a way to level up your armor and make it stronger and give you more defense. But again, that's going to be confusing if you have a certain piece of armor and its level up doesn't count somewhere else. Plus the part where it would kind of break the base game yet again. So all of this is pointing to what we really need is a completely new type of buff that just does the thing that we want. It makes you more powerful and gives you more defense, and it's so separate from everything else that it obviously applies only in the DLC zone. And I'm sure that idea must have rang a bell in Miyazaki's head and the rest of the designers too, because of Sekiro, another game by FromSoft. In that game, there is such a thing as this blessing that kind of stacks over time, and you get it from beating bosses in that game. But what they want in Elden Ring's expansion is actually the opposite of that. They want you to be able to fight a boss, have difficulty, and then go do non-boss things in order to become more powerful. So it wouldn't actually make sense for the goals of the designers here if the only way to power up was to beat the bosses. I think it would make more sense from the player's point of view if that's how it worked, but that's not what Miyazaki was going for. Even though it is kind of a weird idea to have these Scadutree Fragments kind of all over the place, and collecting them and exploring is what powers you up. It really is consistent with how Elden Ring worked overall in the base game. So I see exactly why they did it, and it does make the DLC function. Whereas without this mechanic, it would kind of not work right. I'm well aware of how controversial this mechanic is, but overall, I'm going to give it mostly a thumbs up. I think it does its job, but there is a caveat here. There's something that I think is very annoying about it. To illustrate what I mean about this annoyance, I'm going to bring up two games, Grand Theft Auto 3 and Donkey Kong Country, both very old games at this point. In Grand Theft Auto 3, they had a feature where there are secret packages hidden around the map, and it's an open world game. It was kind of like the first open world game, and it was huge. Okay, so there's this enormous environment where packages are randomly hidden here and there, and there's 100 of them, so a huge number of them, and it was horribly tedious to deal with because there was no way to track which ones have you found, and like generally where should you look. Whereas Donkey Kong Country is completely the opposite. That game is broken into levels, and within a level, there is one very well hidden Donkey Kong coin, and you know if you have it or not. So there's such a thing as like, oh, I don't have the one in this level, let me go look for it. And it's just way less tedious to deal with. So whenever I see a game kind of do the Grand Theft Auto 3 thing where there's a whole bunch of hidden things and no way to track it, I just immediately realize what tedium I'm going to be in for. And that is how the Scadutree Fragments work. Now you might say, hold on, what about all the many kinds of collectible things in the base game that are very similar? What about those? Do I have the same complaint about those? And well, not so, I mean, a little bit, but not so much. In the base game, there are sacred tiers, and collecting those makes your potions more powerful over time. But the sacred tiers are all in churches. There's also golden seeds in the base game, and collecting all of those gives you access to a larger and larger quantity of potions. And those golden seeds are all by trees. They're all by glowing Erdtrees or ulcerated tree spirits, which are a little bit harder to find, but there's some kind of theme there. Also, you do not need to find all of the golden seeds in order to reach the maximum upgrade. So if you didn't find those last 2 or 3 ulcerated tree spirits that have the golden seeds, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference in maxing out your potions. But that is not how it works for the Scadutree Fragments. You have to find all of them in order to max out that bonus. And they're kind of just randomly anywhere. Sometimes they're at a really obvious point of grace. Sometimes beating a boss gives you one, or it's in front of the boss, or sometimes a random nothing enemy gives you one, or there's one in a cave or something. I know it's very anti-FromSoft if they gave you any way to track anything, but it sure would have been nice, or at least put in some extra ones like they did with Golden Seeds. You don't really have to find them all to max it out. It's a minor point, so let's just move on. Part 2, didn't expect nothing, or map design. This is my first of a few negative comments about the game's design, but even before I say it, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I'm not hating on it at all, and again, I kind of said it's a masterpiece and a huge thumbs up, but even something that's very good can have some issues, okay? And one of those issues is how empty this game is. This expansion has several different areas in it, and 3 of these areas, and to avoid spoilers, I'll just kind of vaguely say that 2 of them have to do with fingers, and one of them is quite maddening. Anyway, these 3 areas are just over the top in how barren they are. It's actually weird. And I looked up what other people thought about this, and it's kind of controversial. There's some people who think that it's actually amazing and great because all of those areas have wonderful atmosphere and they give a certain vibe very well. I agree with that. They are a big success on that metric. But this is also a game, and there's supposed to be things to explore and things to do. And these 3 particular areas feel just incredibly empty, like it wasn't finished or something. And many other areas in this expansion just seem a lot bigger or emptier than they needed to be. You're exploring and you're looking around, and there's just nothing sometimes, or there's really useless items that no one's going to care about. Some crafting material or a cookbook or smithing stones that you don't need anymore. So why is this? Why are there several areas that feel just a little too empty? Well, I have a theory about that. I think there's about 3 components that are going on here. First is for the 3 areas I mentioned that are especially empty, I think that is on purpose, and they really just are leaning as hard as they can into theme and vibes and the lore of the world. And I do think that is a bit of a misfire. I actually wonder if they're going to patch this expansion and add a little bit more stuff in those areas. And the second thing that's going on is the game is beautiful. It has amazing views and landscapes. There's so many incredible screenshots you can take all over this world. And they're so conscious of that I think that maybe contributed to things being bigger and grandiose than they needed to be for the sake of beauty. Okay. But I actually think it's the third thing that's driving a lot of this. This is maybe a crackpot theory, but here you go. This is a minor bit of a spoiler because I'm showing you something from the game, but it is in the very first area of the game. So if you don't want to know that, you can skip ahead a few seconds. Near the beginning of the DLC area is a tower that's called the Suppressing Tower. And here is what you can read if you go to the top of that tower. It says it's the very center of the lands between. And at first glance, that's pretty weird because if you just look at the map of the DLC area, it doesn't really seem to be in the center of that map. But what if you put the entire map of the DLC on top of the old map and you aligned it so that this tower was in the center of the old map? What would that look like? Well, here you go. And as you can see, it perfectly lines up. This must have been so satisfying to design. Think of the theme here. The whole expansion is called Shadow of the Erdtree, this concept of a shadow. And here we have negative space in the base game filled in perfectly by the lands of the expansion. It says a lot about the world and the lore, but I'm not going to get into that right now. What I am going to point out is that I think what this did is established before they even made the DLC content just how big it had to be, because it had to fit perfectly into that old map. And I think that might have contributed to some of these areas being kind of larger than they needed to be. Part 3, why is it always down? Or more on map design. The world of this expansion has an incredible amount of verticality. What I mean by that is that you'll be somewhere in this expansion and you'll see that right next to you is a really high cliff and there's stuff up there. If only you could get there somehow. And you look down and there's another cliff, and way down there's a whole other area that maybe you could get to somehow. And you can see that even if you could get to that area, there's another cliff down from there to a whole other area. So you're seeing so much right next to you that you can't quite get to. And that's very interesting. That's something that the base game of Elden Ring did. It's something that FromSoft games have done many times in the past. But what I'm trying to convey to you here is that the degree that they're doing this is way, way, way more than any of those games did. In fact, I can't think of another example in any video game that approaches what they're doing here. So this property of the world, this verticality, is it a good or bad thing design-wise? And I'm going to say, conceptually, it's very good. The designers want to create an interesting, breathtaking world, and this helps do that. The designers want to create a kind of puzzle and how to get from here to there, and this does that. It's honestly really impressive, but there is a big negative, and I don't think that this big negative is conceptual or inherent. It just has to do with the details of how this came together, and it's really unfortunate. There were multiple times over my course of playing through this expansion where there were large portions of the map that I hadn't got to and I couldn't figure out how to get to, and it just turns out you can ride there. Like, it's not exactly a puzzle or a very difficult one. It's just that, oh, there was a place I'd been to many times and you could jump down the rocks in a certain area that I happened not to have seen. And you might think, oh, well, I was rushing through, I wasn't being very observant. No, that is not true. I was being super careful, and I just happened to not see 2 or 3 ways to go here or there. And that is not a big complaint. Please don't think that that's my point. Oh, I missed a couple things and I'm salty about it. No, no, no. I'm just letting you know where I was coming from. So what I realized from that if I had looked even more carefully at just how to jump down here or there, that I could have gotten to those areas without much trouble, what it made me do naturally is look more carefully everywhere else. These 2 or 3 areas were not the only ones in the map that I had trouble accessing. There were many other huge areas that I could see that they existed. I just couldn't figure out how to get there. So I would go to the edge of a cliff and look down to where I can't go and thought, well, what if I followed this cliff all the way around one way and all the way around the other way, and just looked very carefully. And I did that so much for so long, for hours and hours, that it really became the defining experience of the whole DLC for me. Day 1, I was on a new adventure and I was fighting bosses and doing pretty well, even though the bosses are kind of hard. Day 2, beat some more bosses. Great. Day 3, I found a ladder in a tower that I couldn't get to, and the tower is super complicated and confusing, and I spent all day trying to get to that ladder. If you played this, you know which one I mean. Probably the second half of my ladder day was riding around the world and looking at cliff sides, and then the 4th day was pretty much entirely riding around the world and looking at cliff sides. It got just way more boring for me really quickly when it became, how do I get to these other areas, instead of the adventure I feel like I was supposed to be on. And what I found very annoying as a player is that the answer to how to get to some of these key big areas is actually not to be more observant while riding around them, as I had mentioned happened to be earlier. It's going to entire other parts of the game and doing a little thing or noticing a little thing that you would just kind of not know to do. There's one in particular that in order to do the thing you have to do, I feel like you pretty much just have to look that up in a guide. And there's another where there is kind of a way to go, but it doesn't really look like anything, and it's so easily missable. And yet it's the gateway to a whole other big part of the game. And what I'm emphasizing here is that it wasn't that I was near that other part of the game and looking for a way to get in. There was kind of no way to ever guess that the way to get in was to go to this completely other zone. And even though I know all this is very much in the vibe of FromSoft, they just don't give a fuck about if you're lost or don't know what to do or have to look at a guide or whatever. And I really tried to avoid guides, by the way. I know all of that, but it's just so extreme. This world that they built is incredible. The level design that they've created is incredible, but I wish that it just wasn't so much about how to get down, about how to find a cliff to jump down or how to do a thing that you would never guess to do that ultimately leads to you going down an elevator somewhere. The devil's in the detail of tuning, and this stuff about getting to these certain areas just didn't work for me. I didn't have the aha moments, and I didn't even feel satisfied when I finally realized how it did work. I think it just needs a few more clues or something. As I'm sure you can see, I'm kind of conflicted about this because I do feel like I should point out the negatives of how a lot of my experience was running around being lost and not knowing how to get a place, and that's kind of bad. But at the same time, I have so much appreciation for this level design. There's a certain keep, and I'm sure you know which one if you've played this expansion, that once you fully understand how it's put together and what it leads to and what the 3D model of this place fully looks like, if you could, look at it in an editor and move it all around, is so intricate and incredible that I can't help but be in awe of it. So there's a lot to love here as well. Here's a minor gripe, but I think it's worth pointing out. It is a small design detail that really does have an effect on the fun factor of the game, and that is smithing stones. Smithing stones are a crafting material that you use to upgrade your weapons, and I'm not going to critique how that works in the base game. I'm just going to take that as given. You use a bunch of smithing stones and you power up your weapon, and you're expected to have a fully powered up weapon by the time you reach the expansion. Not just one, I think you probably have multiple. And there's also something called bell bearings, which are items you can get in the base game that once you have those, you don't actually have to hunt down all the smithing stones anymore. You can just buy them. The placement of the bell bearings in the base game tells me a lot about what the designers want us to do. And the idea is that in the early game of the base game, you get, let's say, smithing stone 1, 2, and 3, and maybe 4. But at this point, they're like, okay, you've gotten that far. We're going to give you a way to just get as many 1s and 2s as you want from now on. And then maybe you can get access to 5 and 6, and they're like, okay, at this point, we're going to let you have all of the 3s and 4s that you want. Now, I know all the details. I know that that's not exactly correct, but that's basically how it works. So by the time you reach the expansion, you're expected to have all those bell bearings, and it is trivial to just upgrade any weapon to max. It's trivial, but it's not instant. You have to click on a menu like 10 or 20 times, or on a different one, 25 or 50 times, because I think you click once and then there's a confirmation. So even clicking through it takes time, but also there's the material and the money that you need to do that process. And so you've got to farm that money, and it's not hard. It doesn't take that long, but it's not actually adding anything to the game. Now let's go back to talking about the expansion, where this issue really seems like a problem. So you're in this new DLC world and you find a new sword or something and you pick it up, and can you use it? Well, it's garbage. And what you have to do is farm a little bit and have enough runes and go buy all the smithing stones and then max it out. And now you can use it. So why is that? It doesn't actually add anything. It's just really annoying. Every time you find a new weapon, and that happens many, many times in this DLC, that weapon is a useless piece of garbage until you do this chore. And it feels like you shouldn't have to do that anymore once you've reached the DLC. All these new weapons probably should have just dropped at max level, or maybe a better idea than that, to enable challenge runs to exist still, is let them drop as useless garbage, but have a new mechanic where you can just instantly upgrade it to max trivially. If that existed, the game wouldn't be any easier at all, but it would be less tedious. The spellcasting UI, the controls to cast spells in the base game of Elden Ring, is really the weakest part of the entire game, in my opinion. You can hold up to 10 spells, or 12 if you use an item that no one would use. And in order to cycle through those, you got to go up, up, up through a linear list. And the only extra tool you have is that if you hold up, you can jump to the very first item in the list. But it's excruciating to use. It makes casting spells way more cumbersome and annoying than it really should be. So many times I feel like I'm losing to the UI rather than to the boss. And it really just shouldn't be this way. I think it's okay to be a huge fan of Elden Ring and to really love what they did, but to critique this one element as just not being good enough. I really hope that people do not show up in the comments of this video and say, actually, it's totally fine to scroll through a 10-item linear list one at a time in the middle of combat. No, it isn't. Have some kind of quality bar. Okay, let's do things a better way than that. I really wish that enough people complained about this that we could see some kind of patch or better system. An example is Ghost of Tsushima has a really great system where you hold down R2 and then you instantly have access to 8 moves. The 4 face buttons do 4 of the moves, and the 4 D-pad directions do another while you're holding down a button. I have a whole UI in mind that would let you cast all of your spells very quickly and still be able to do all your Ashes of War. It's possible, it's doable. And I was really disappointed and a bit surprised that the expansion did nothing on this. If this were a normal review rather than a game design analysis, I would cover a lot of the content of the game, but I'm not going to do that here. There is a ton of content. There's so many new weapons and spells and Ashes of War, and there's so many areas and bosses. There's just a huge playground, and a lot of it is really fun. I also don't want to spoil it and show you all those things. I just want to say that I appreciate almost all of it. I know that there are a lot of complaints about the bosses in this expansion. So that's really the one part of this content I wanted to cover from a design point of view. What's going on with these bosses? Okay, in the base game, there's a situation where you can summon these ghost spirits to help you fight, and it makes the fights way easier. It's basically a built-in difficulty system. And I have played the base game many times over in many builds. I played it with spirit summons. I played it without summoning a single spirit the entire run. I know the ins and outs of this. It's a lot harder to play the game without spirits, but it's completely doable. The expansion feels different. I went into it thinking I would try the whole thing without summoning a single spirit again, and it's just so hard that it feels like it's tuned for you to use the spirits, and I think that's putting a lot of people off. The bosses are so aggressive and in your face that the spirits feel more necessary than they were before. I guess I don't have a very strong opinion about that. I mean, you could say that's maybe a negative about these bosses, or it could just be a skill issue. As we get more used to fighting these bosses, maybe this will seem like less of a thing over time. I'm not really sure at this point. That's most of what I have to say. And even though I had some negatives, I really want to emphasize that this expansion is beautiful and intricate, and it's a huge new playground, both physically, but also with all of the new weapons and items and spells and bosses. There's just so much to do that I hope you give it a try if you liked Elden Ring at all. And also, it's really fun reading everyone's dumb messages. So good luck, fellow Tarnished, and I'll read whatever you write in game.